Hello, mon ami. Today, I want to tell you about Esportspools. It's a service for taking the offer, the game your way. You want to pick the scream, headshot king with one taps, then pick the scream. You are, how you say, the boss. Perhaps you prefer to bet. Then place a wager on the game of your choice. Keep composure and show that you can be calm. Maybe you lose, maybe you win. Either way, I hope you end up happy. Now, Happy, the in-game leader of Team Envious, is one of the greatest players in CSGO history. Now, I didn't say one of the greatest in-game leaders, but he is both one of the greatest leaders and one of the greatest in-game leaders in history. He is one of the rare people who occupies both slots. Perhaps the only other person you could really contrast with that is Fallen currently. He is second on the all-time list for majors won by an in-game leader. He is tied with Fallen, and he is behind only Pronax, who has 3. Obviously, Happy has 2. He has taken 3 different lineups to top 4 finishes at majors. There was the LDLC with Apex and Kaylee. There was the Envious lineup that obviously won as LDLC. DreamHack Winter 2014 and had Shocks and Smiths in it. There was the second Envious lineup that had Apex and Kenny S in it after the second French Shuffle. And of top 4 finishes, he has had a total of 5 top 4 finishes at majors or better, and they were 5 in a row. So we can see, as an in-game leader, his accomplishments are exceptional. Now, as an individual player, he was both the star player of the first LDLC, I'm talking about post-shuffle lineup, Envious lineup, the one with Shocks and Smiths and Kiyoshima and MBK. Arguably, he was the MVP of the first major he won, DreamHack Winter 2014, which is the 4th major of CSGO. We're now approaching our 12th. And he helped to break the meta game of how people played with the aggro force spying, typically CZ abuse, especially late in 2014. They had strong CT sides in those squads, much like Fnatic, but perhaps a little bit weaker on the CT side. And then on the T side, another element of breaking the meta game was he evolved this brute force lurk and death ball style, where he would lurk on one part of the map, try and make a read, you know, a la what Get Right might have done in NIP. The difference was Get Right wasn't the leader of NIP. Happy was the leader of NIP, of LDLC and Envious. He was the best player, and not only could he lurk effectively and get a lot of kills, but he would lurk on one side of the map, then use information he'd gotten from his team and what he had from himself on the other part of the map to make a read, from which then he would call this death ball style, where the other 4 would roll onto a site, attack it heavily, often fairly dry because his team force sport and played with low economy so often, and just went off individual skill and people hitting those 1 or 2 tap AK entries like Kiyoshima, like Apex, like Shocks, that would then enable this style to work. And then, being a lurker, he would come in the back and he would either backstab people, or he would come all the way around with the rotation and he would potentially win a clutch. Although admittedly he wasn't as good a clutch player as Shocks has been in other teams, but he was alright at it. Now, why did he fall off? If he was such a great in-game leader, if he accomplished such amazing things, if even individually he was such a strong player, because that's the thing, in all regards he's fallen off. Like, if you look at him now, individually and as an in-game leader, he's gotten much weaker. But as an in-game leader, he has now proven to be very weak. I mean, especially at the big lands this year, and over the last 2 years, to be honest, we've had a lot of poor placings. He hasn't made good use of some of the talent he's had in the last few teams. He's had Kenny S, he's had Scream, hasn't used them particularly well. Admittedly, he did have one exception to that, which is RPK has blossomed under him in the last year. That's one of his actual success stories in the last 2 years. Can't know how much that's him, but I'll give him credit for that. Now contrast that to the past, though, and you'll see people having their career peaks under him. Kiyoshima has never been better than he was when he was in late 2014 playing for Happy in LDLC. For my money, he was the MVP of that tournament, because he actually took over the final. It was very, very close against NIP and allowed the team to win, and he was playing this entry style in an entry core with Shocks. NBK mastered the support position in 2014, mostly 2015, under Happy, and playing this new role that was very different from the past roles where he'd been either a star or a second star, or he'd been the lurker. Now he was playing as pretty much a pure support along with Happy in many of the sites. Smiths had his career peak in CSGO, late 2014, playing with Happy, where he actually had very explosive AWP, was great, obviously, when he was pushed off it because he had the CZ, which didn't have the same draw time as it does now. You go beyond using players poorly, he's had terrible placings. I mean, whereas he had all those amazing run of form in the first couple of years, this guy has finished last place at like half of his events over this year. Individually, he's decayed as a fragger, especially at the bigger events. So why has he fallen off in this way? Well, first of all, in terms of his team, poor leadership skills are one main reason. And I did a video about this entirely itself. He doesn't know how to get the best out of the people he plays with. He comes in with a set idea of how they should play. Sadly, over the last couple of years, it's still been largely centered around a lot of what he did for 2014 and 2015. And so it's a very antiquated idea, which at the time was revolutionary and innovative and broke the meta, but now has actually been superseded by the meta that then responded to that, countered that, and neutralized that. So he comes in with this set idea, and if you have other notions, you're shit out of luck. You're going to have to play that style. Beyond that, when people do make their suggestions, this year, I'm not as sure. He might have been better this year, but last year, he was very poor at taking input. He would actually be someone who, even if he's an in-game leader, would to some degree sort of sulk and be confrontational, but in the sense of like confrontational, like he confronts the idea, but then he doesn't actually discuss it. He's just like, I don't want to do that. That's wrong. Like, I'm telling you to do it this way. And also, he wanted to kind of be unquestioned to some degree. Then you got to look at the fact that he has been a poor motivator. This is someone where, again, in line with that other video, hasn't been very good at raising the morale of his team, keeping their spirits up, making them believe and buy into his system and what he wants to do. In fact, when things have gone badly, he's been one of the worst in that regard. A small detail, admittedly you can make whole videos about this, and obviously G2's no better, but his force buying style, which he still maintains as a massive strategy, not quite as bad as 2016, which was the worst I've ever seen of a team that could potentially be top 10. The force buying style has still forced Sport Envious into oblivion at times and has put them in bad spots and has not allowed them full utility, not allowed them full weaponry, and now they have a worse team than they have in the past. So they can get away with that crutch of having the superstar players and the deathball style and him lurking even less without the utility and without proper weapons for his players who aren't the best in the server often at these big events to be able to utilize. Another key factor, I think, especially if you look at the last 2 years, is he has not been good at working with the AWP in any context. I mean, classically, his style, Smith's, yes, was a good AWPer at the time in late 2014, but that was CT side. On the T side, he hasn't really been able to make use of the AWP. I mean, funnily enough, even Smith's, who was at his career peak, was only really a good AWPer on the T side when he was on Dust 2, which is obviously a map that very much the AWP can control the middle there. And then even then he was more of a CT side AWPer. You look at the players he's played with over the last couple of years. With Kenny S was in arguably the worst form of his career over the time he was in Envious with Happy and didn't have AWPs a lot of the time. Happy himself would take the AWP. Happy has not proven to be a very good AWPer. I think actually if you look at Dupree recently taking on the AWP in the stead of Device, I think Dupree's proven himself to be a much better AWP than Happy has when Happy's been doing it. With that said though, Happy probably still better than Sixer, and Sixer's been a player who's been a dedicated AWPer in this team. Has Happy found a way to use him, someone who's going to do what he says? Not really. Again, he's only really getting any kind of impact on the CT side, and he's not getting many frags with the weapons. So I think it is a knock on Happy that when the meta changed and his personnel changed, he went from having an amazing 5 rifle team in the late 2014 LDLC and Envious team to having these AWPers, in the case of Kenny S, someone who should have been a very, very good AWPer, perhaps the best AWPer, and he has not been able to utilize him or integrate him into his system, and yet he still runs the same system, and therefore it is less effective. His style and system is something you have to talk about because he still sticks with the force buys. They don't work, especially they haven't worked for the last 2 years, even when he had the skill lineup in 2016, and they don't work now with less skill. He runs the same. Happy lurks on one side of the map. Happy is last into the site. The death ball explodes or attacks elsewhere. There's a bit more tactics now, a bit more utility. Clearly he makes use of the coach and of the analysts more, but he's still stuck in his paradigm of how to play the game. I think it's actually very significant, beyond not being able to use AWPers, that actually he hasn't in the long term been able to get his entry fraggers to buy into his system and to enjoy playing under him. They have their success early in the lineup, first 3 to 5 months. After that, it becomes a living hell, and these guys actively find a way out of the team. So think of his 3 main entries he's had. He's had Shox. Yes, that's right. Shox, the best player in the world in 2013, the best mid-round and clutch player at that time. In 2014 and early 2015, was playing as one of the entry core in LDLC Envious, because actually Shox wasn't the best player in that team. Happy was much better at that point in time. Kiyashima was doing well. Shox was in a period where he just wanted to win again, and so he was willing to do these things. It had its success early on with all the top 4s and winning the major and big tournaments, but eventually Shox got tired of that. Even though actually there was a brief period, sort of the first 3 months of 2015, where Shox was very good at that role. He got tired of that. He didn't want to do it anymore. He didn't like that style of having to be a raw entry where you don't have a lot of support. Apex, yes, he got to win a major with Happy. Thanks a lot. That was great. We had a great time there. Apex dropping 50 over 2 months was a key quality to the envious teams winning games at the end of 2015. But by the end, and especially for most of 2016, Apex didn't like it. He was in hell. He was just running in dry, getting his head banged off, and he didn't have proper support. He didn't have an in-game leader there with him helping him. He was just running into a brick wall over and over again and then being told, that is your job. Go and do it. Why can you not headshot like Kyo? Then you've got to add in Kiyoshima. So remember, the reason Kiyoshima was kicked, by the way, for anyone who doesn't know this, was he was very lackluster at practice, he wasn't having much in-game impact, and then he had a somewhat bad attitude, even though they were having some success. So one of the reasons why he didn't like it was he didn't like the way the entry core was set up. He didn't like the way he was being used in the team. He lost motivation. He didn't have an in-game leader who could get him to buy back in or tweak his system. It was, you do this, it is my way or is the highway. And so all of his entries, either by being kicked or leaving, have left him, have deserted him. And so one of the problems with his style for entries is he does leave you out on an island. Not least, by the way, because he's not there on the map to coordinate with you. He's not there like an MSL or a Glaive or a Kagan to help you with the entry, to set up the flashes, to make sure he makes a read before you make your entry. He's not even there. He's over the other side of the map, and then he tells you, oh, just run in now. And you want to just think, you can't see what I'm seeing. You can't know what the setup is. What do you mean run in now? And you just have to. If you don't, then you're considered a troublemaker and a bad influence within the team. I mean, funnily enough, consider this difference between when he had Apex the first time around. So LDLC made it to top 4 at ESL 1 Clone 2014, the third CSGO major, and they were 2 rounds from making the final, and I think actually might have won that final. I think they were better than NiP. I think it would have been a very interesting matchup with Fnatic, because it was a different lineup, remember, from the lineup that he later had to win the next major, because this was the lineup where he had Kaylee and he had let me think. Oh, he had Apex, obviously, and he had Maniac, and I think Uzi was the last guy, right? So in this team, Apex was absolutely a very good player. Kaylee was a pretty good player, but he wasn't as good as he was in Titan later, and obviously we can't know if he's cheating at this point in time, but that tournament was an all-time great Apex performance. I think if he'd have gotten to the final, and definitely if the team had won the tournament, he would have been the MVP of that tournament. His numbers were unreal. Now, why is that? Yes, it's obviously because Apex was in different form, but more than that, Happy didn't used to play this lurking bait style at the time. He didn't have the same paradigm for how to play the game. He just took the players he had, and like a good in-game leader, worked tactics around them, and he himself was part of the tactics. He would take part in the execution. He was much more proactive and further ahead in the pack, and therefore helping his entry fragger be more effective. So part of the problem here is that the style has not only decayed, but then players within it start to feel the limitations of the style. They feel chained down, and then they lose hope, and he doesn't have any way to turn it around. A reason that's very underrated, I actually think, as to why Happy fell off as well, is actually purely a patch-based change. Is that if you ever go back to his prime, late 2014, first sort of 3 to 4 months of 2015, he was one of the main players who used the M4A1, the silenced Colt carbine. At least it was called the Colt carbine in the original version of Counter-Strike. Now, he was one of the people who not only used this weapon, but really relied on heavily spraying with it and being inside smokes. Funnily enough, off the top of my head, I think Dupree also suffered when this changed. If you notice, when his career form had its issues in 2016, I think that was one of the reasons. So he was someone who really relied on that, because if you ever go back and use that weapon, you ever go and watch the videos, and you try and use the weapon now, it's much, much worse at spraying. It's still pretty good, but it was fantastic back then. That's why so many pros used it. Also, you got to add in as a final reason, his lurking style got exposed. Funnily enough, this happened to Get Right. This happened to pretty much everyone who was a dedicated lurker. Hiko, no one who just 24/7 as a lurker ever got away with it forever. Part of the reason why, by the way, is that's not actually a role. That's a role you can play in certain tactics or certain times on a map. It's not a dedicated role like AWP, like whenever I can, I'm going to be lurking and I'm going to be on this side of the map. Because eventually it becomes obvious. I've told this story before about how a certain team in Counter-Strike, I don't think I referenced the team, once told me, and I had another team say, actually, they agreed with it, that when they played against these teams, even the very good ones that Happy was in, they would purposely, if they saw Happy, they would bait him out with Tech 9s and Glocks and USPs, etc., so that he would rush out thinking that they were they were on eco, and then they would just kill him. So they knew if they found him, he was on his own. And since they knew he was on his own, they could exploit that. And since they knew where he was, they could call the rotation to the other site. And I think this is one of the reasons why, even at their prime, actually, they had a lot of issues grinding out those T-sides. They could still do it. They were such a fantastic team, but they didn't very often put up the double-digit T-sides, except maybe on Dust 2 in the occasional cash game, where you could play a very dry, aim-heavy style, takes a lot of duels, and have Kiyoshima and Apex and Shocks frag people's heads off, and then just leave NBK and Happy to win the clutches. So I think actually that his lurking style has been exposed. And he also proved in 2016, when he wasn't the in-game leader, that he couldn't do it if he wasn't the in-game leader. If he wasn't the in-game leader, now he had no read on the game. He had very bad comms, and he was just essentially baiting. It wasn't very good. Now, in the current lineup, I think within the lurking style, another flaw is that online, part of the reason I think his results are so good, if you look into it, is they play a very simple style. They play like default style. They have some tactics. They just run them over and over again. It doesn't almost matter who the opponent is, just matters what the map is. And it works, actually. They actually get pretty good results out of it. Then they go to LAN, their style changes up, and suddenly Happy's making all these hero reads all over the place, thinking it is late 2014, and he's going to make the amazing read that's going to, first of all, make him have an impact on the game as a lurker, and then also get his team onto a site. And it just doesn't. They don't get that many bomb plants. They don't get into these good situations, and they run into these brick walls, partly because his style has been almost entirely exposed and somewhat figured out and nerfed. Now, personally, this might sound like I'm just ragging on the guy. No, I actually, as I opened the video with, I consider him one of the greats of all time. It's actually very sad to me. It's somewhat tragic that he's stuck in this paradigm and that he hasn't been able to work his way out, and that even when he actually has, funnily enough, turned out to have some talent. We already knew Scream was very good, but now he has RPK. And you know what? XMS is a rising talent within France who probably could have done great things under someone else. He has some talent out there, but he's not making very good use of it. And that's actually kind of tragic, because whether or not he can ever be in the best French team again, or whether he can win a major again, okay, these are probably not reasonable or plausible premises for now. But he certainly could be in a better team. He could be in a team that's contending. He could be at least on the table to come back to a G2 or something. There's so much more that this guy could do, because he was truly great as an in-game leader and as an individual player.
Welcome, everybody. Blessed are those that visit this channel and enjoy the content here.